And welcome back to Regaining the Balance. We're going to continue with our audiobook of Psychology and Religion, East and West. And today's section will be Psychology of a Natural Symbol. So let me just make sure everything's working good. I got the right sound. I can hear my own voice. It's about a 30-second delay on this thing. And it looks good. Just want to make sure that it's not clipping either, because it did that not too long ago. So let me share the screen here. Well, let me do this first, then share the screen. So we're going to continue with this here. So the history and psychology of a natural symbol. Although I have no wish to discourage philosophical curiosity, I would rather not lose myself in a discussion of the ethical and intellectual aspects of the problem raised by the quaternity symbol. Its psychological importance is far reaching and plays a considerable role in practical treatment. While we are not concerned here with psychotherapy, but with the religious aspect of certain psychic phenomena, I have been forced through my studies in psychopathology to dig out these historical symbols and figures from the dust of their graves. When when I was a young alienist, I should never have suspected myself of doing such a thing. I shall not mind, therefore, if this long discussion of the quaternity symbol, the circulus quadratus, and the heretical attempts to improve on the dogma of the Trinity seem to be somewhat far-fetched and exaggerated. But in point of fact, my whole discourse on the quaternity is no more than a regrettably short and inadequate introduction to the final crowning example which illustrates my case. And I just want to let you guys know it's storming like crazy out here. So if you hear a little background noise, I apologize. It is the way that it is. I'll try to talk over it. I have a pretty deep voice, so. Oh, and also, if you like these videos, share, subscribe, all that jazz. Already at the very beginning of our dream series, the circle appears. It takes the form, for instance, of a serpent, which describes a circle round the dreamer. It appears in later dreams as a clock, a circle with a central point, a round target for shooting practice, a clock that is a perpetuum mobile, a ball, a globe, a round table, a basin, and so on. The square appears also about the same time in the form of a city square or a garden with a fountain in the center. Somewhat later it appears in connection with a circular movement. People walking around in a square, a magic ceremony, the transformation of animals into human beings, takes place in a square room, in the corners of which are four snakes, with people again circulating around the four corners. The dreamer driving around a square in a taxi, a square prison cell, an empty square which is itself rotating, and so on. In other dreams, a circle is represented by rotation. For instance, four children carry a dark ring, quote unquote, and walk in a circle. Again, the circle appears combined with the quaternity as a silver bowl with four nuts at the four cardinal points, or as a table with four chairs. The center seems to be particularly emphasized. It is symbolized by an egg in the middle of a ring, by a star consisting of a body of soldiers, by a star rotating in a circle, the cardinal points of which represent the four seasons, by the pole, by a precious stone, and so on. All these dreams lead up to one image which came to the patient in the form of a sudden visual impression. He had had such glimpses or visualizations on several occasions before, but this time it was a most impressive experience. As he himself says, it was an impression of the most sublime harmony. In such a case, it does not matter at all what our impression is or what we think about it. It only matters how the patient feels about it. It is his experience, and it is as a deeply transforming influence upon his condition. There is no point in arguing against it. The psychologist can only take note of the fact, and if he feels equal to the task, he might also make an attempt to understand why such a vision had such an effect upon such a person. The vision was a turning point in the patient's psychological development. It was what one would call, in the language of religion, a conversion. It is the literal text of the vision. And here we have a colon in some italicized area, so quoting, there is a vertical and horizontal circle. Having a common center, this is the world clock. It is supported by the blackbird. The vertical circle is a blue disk with a white border divided into 4 by 8 equals 32 partitions. Makes you wonder about the whole 32, 33 Freemasonry thing. A pointer rotates upon it. The horizontal circle consists of 4 colors. On it stand 4 little men with pendulums, and round about it is laid the ring that was once dark and is now golden, formerly carried by 4 children. The world clock has 3 rhythms or pulses. Number 1, the small pulse. The pointer of the blue vertical disc advances by 1 by 32. The second middle pulse, 1 complete rotation of the pointer at the same time. The horizontal circle advances again by 1 by 32, and the great pulse, the 32 middle pulses, are equal to 1 complete rotation of the golden ring. Okay, and that's unquoting the italicized section. The vision sums up all the illusions of the previous dreams. It seems to be an attempt to make a meaningful whole of the formerly fragmented symbol, then characterized as circle, globe, square, rotation, clock, star, cross, quaternity, time, and so on. Huh. Wow. Excuse me for a second. It is, of course, to understand what a feeling of, quote, most sublime harmony, unquote, should be produced by this abstract structure. But if we think of the 2 circles in Plato's Timaeus and of the harmonious all-roundness of his anima mundi, we might find an avenue to understanding. Again, the term, quote, quote, world clock, unquote, suggests the antique conception of the musical harmony of the spheres. It would thus be a sort of cosmological system if it were a vision of the firmament and its silent rotation, or of the steady movement of the solar system. We could readily understand and appreciate the perfect harmony of the picture. We might also assume that the Platonic vision of the cosmos was faintly glimmering through the mist of a dreamlike consciousness. But there is something in the vision that does not quite accord with the harmonious perfection of the Platonic picture. The 2 circles are each of a different nature. Not only is their movement different, but their color too. The vertical circle is blue, and the horizontal one, containing 4 colors, is golden. The blue circle might easily symbolize the blue hemisphere of the sky, while the horizontal circle would represent the horizon, which with its 4 cardinal points, personified by the 4 little men and characterized by the 4 colors. In a former dream, the 4 points were represented once by 4 children and another time by 4 seasons. This picture immediately calls to mind the medieval representations of the world in the form of a circle or in the shape of a rex gloriae, with the 4 evangelists or the melothesia, where the horizon is formed by the zodiac. The representation of the triumphant Christ seems to be derived from a similar pictures of Horus and his 4 sons. There are also Eastern analogies. The Buddhist mandalas or circles, usually of Tibetan origins. These consist of a rule of a circular padma or lotus, which contains a square sacred building with 4 gates indicating the 4 cardinal points and the seasons. The center contains a Buddha, or more often the conjunction of Shiva and his Shakti. And remember, Shiva and Shakti worship is started by the Pani/Phoenicians, guys. Or as an equivalent dorje, thunderbolt symbol. They are yantras, or ritualistic instruments for the purpose of contemplation, concentration, and the final transformation of the yogi's consciousness into the divine all-consciousness. However striking these analogies may be, they are not entirely satisfactory because all they emphasize the center to such an extent that they seem to have been made in order to express the importance of the central figure. In our case, however, the center is empty. It consists only of a mathematical point. The parallels I have mentioned depict the world-creating or world-ruling deity, or else man in his dependence upon the celestial constellations. Our symbol is a clock, symbolizing time. The only analogy I can think of to such a symbol is the design of a horoscope. It too has 4 cardinal points and an empty center. And there is another remarkable correspondence. Rotation is often mentioned in the previous dreams, and this is usually reported as moving to the left. The horoscope has 12 houses that progress numerically to the left, that is, counterclockwise. But the horoscope consists of 1 circle only, and moreover contains no contrast between 2 obvious different systems. So the horoscope, too, is an unsatisfactory analogy. Though it sheds some light on the time aspect of our symbol, we would be forced to give up our attempts to find psychological parallels were it not for the treasure house of the medieval symbolism. By a lucky chance, I came across a little-known medieval author of the 14th century, Guillaume de Goulleville, prior to a monastery at Chailly, a Norman poet who wrote 3 pèlerinages between 1330 and 1355. They were Les Pèlerinages de la vie humaine de l'âme and de Jésus-Christ. In the last canto of the Pèlerinage de l'âme, we find a vision of paradise. Paradise consists of 49 rotating spheres. They are called siècles, centuries, being the prototypes of it, or archetypes of the earthly centuries. But as the angel who serves as a guide to Guillaume explains, the ecclesiastical expression in secula secolorum means eternity and not ordinary time. A golden heaven surrounds all the spheres. When Guillaume looked up to the golden heaven, he suddenly became aware of a small circle, only 3 feet wide, of the color of sapphire. He says of this circle, quote, "It came out of the golden heaven at one point and re-entered it in another, and it made the whole tour of the golden heaven," unquote. Evidently, the blue circle was rolling like a disk upon a great circle which intersected the golden sphere of heaven. Here then we have 2 different systems, the one golden, the other blue, and one cutting through the other. What is the blue circle? The angel again explains to the wandering Guillaume. Okay, so it's in French and in English. I'll just read you guys the English part. This circle is the calendar, which, spinning round the course entire, shows the feast day of each saint, and when it should be celebrate. Each saint goes round all the way. Each star you see stands for a day, and every sun denotes a spell of 30 days zodiacal. The blue circle is the ecclesiastical calendar, so here we have another parallel, the element of time. It will be remembered that time in our vision is characterized or measured by 3 pulses. Guillaume's calendar circle is 3 feet in diameter. Moreover, while Guillaume is gazing at the blue circle, 3 spirit clad in purple suddenly appear. How interesting. In purple, huh? The angel explains that this is the feast day of the 3 saints, and he goes on to discourse about the whole zodiac. When he comes to the sign of the fishes, he mentions the feast of the 12 fishermen, which precedes that of the Holy Trinity, whereupon Guillaume tells the angel that he has never quite understood the symbol of the Trinity. He asks him to be good enough to explain this mystery, whereupon the angel answers, quote, "Well, there are 3 principal colors, green, red, and golden," unquote. One can see them united in a peacock's tail, and he goes on. And that's something I will stop real quick. The peacock's tail, okay, that is something that is also almost as ancient as the quaternity, okay, the cross. You see this in ancient symbolism going way back. So keep that in mind, even though this is being discussed in a Christian type of basis. They're using these really old symbols to illustrate these abstract ideas. So, continuing. And he goes on, quote, "The Almighty King who puts 3 colors in one, cannot he also make one substance into 3, unquote? The golden color, he says, belongs to the Father, the red to the Son, and the green to the Holy Ghost." Then the angel warns the poet not to ask any more questions and disappears. We know, happily enough, from the angel's teaching that 3 has to do with the Trinity, so we also know that our former digression into the field of mystical speculation on the Trinity was not far off the mark. At the same time, we meet with the motif of the colors, but unfortunately our patient has 4, whereas Guillaume, or rather the angel, speaks only of 3, gold, red, and green. Here we might quote the opening words of the Timaeus, quote, "3 there are, but where is the 4th?" unquote. Or we could quote the very same words from Goethe's Faust from the famous Kabiri scene of Part 2, where the Kabiri bring the vision of the mysterious, quote, "streng Gebilde," unquote, the severe image from the sea. And again, the Kabiri are actually related to the Phoenicians as well. And Pythagoras, if I'm not mistaken. The 4 little men of our vision are dwarves or Kabiri. They represent the 4 cardinal points and the 4 seasons, as well as the 4 colors and the 4 elements. In the Timaeus, as also in Faust and in the Pèlerinage, something seems to be wrong with the number 4. The missing 4th color is obviously blue. It is the one that belongs to the series yellow, red, and green. Why is blue missing? What is wrong with the calendar, or with time, or with the color blue? Poor old Guillaume has evidently been stumped by the same problem. There are 3, but where is the 4th? He was always eager to learn something about the Trinity, which, as he says, he had never quite understood, and it is slightly suspicious that an angel in such a hurry to get away before Guillaume can ask any more awkward questions. Indeed. Pardon me for a second. Well, I suppose Guillaume was unconscious when he went to heaven, or otherwise he surely would have drawn certain conclusions from what he saw. Now, what did he actually see? First, he saw the spheres, or siècles. Remember, that means centuries, inhabited by those who had attained eternal bliss. Then he beheld the heaven of gold, the ciel d'or, the sky of gold, and there was the King of Heaven sitting upon a golden throne, and beside him the Queen of Heaven sitting upon a round throne of brown crystal. This latter detail refers to the fact that Mary is supposed to have been taken up to heaven with her body as the only mortal being permitted to unite with the body before the resurrection of the dead. The king is usually represented as the triumphant Christ in conjunction with his bride, the church. But the all-important point is that the king, being Christ, is at the same time the Trinity, and that the introduction of the fourth person, the queen, makes it a quaternity. The royal pair, and again, interestingly enough, this queen, the addition of the queen, right, also brings in the male female attributes together, which is something that our Abrahamic religions have tried so hard to separate. So continuing, the royal pair represents in ideal form the unity of the two under the rule of the one. Again, exactly what I just said, basically. Binarius sub monarchia unari, unquote, as Dorn would say. Moreover, in the brown crystal, the realm of quaternity and the elements into which the four-horned Binarius was cast has been exalted to the throne of the supreme intercessor, Mary. Consequently, the quaternity of the natural elements appears not only in close conjunction with the corpus mysticum of the bridal church or queen of heaven. Often it is difficult to distinguish between the two, but in immediate relationship to the Trinity. Blue is the color of Mary's celestial cloak, and I'm gonna say, you guys, pay attention to a lot of medieval artwork and all that kind of stuff. Mary either has a cloak of white, blue, or gold, depending on where she is in the story. So I'm just saying. But you'll see that a lot, where her cloak is blue, which is also depicting the sky, the firmament, the atmosphere, whatever you want to call it. She is the earth covered by the blue tent of the sky. But why should the Mother of God not be mentioned? According to the dogma, she is only beata, not divine. Moreover, she represents the earth, which is also the body and its darkness. That is the reason why she, the all-merciful, has the power of attorney to plead for all sinners, but also why, despite her privileged position, it is not possible for the angels to sin. She has a relationship with the Trinity which is rationally not comprehensible, since it is so close and yet so distant. As the matrix, the vessel, and the earth, she can be interpreted allegorically as the rotundum, which is characterized by the four cardinal points, and hence as the globe with the four quarters, God's footstool, or as the four square heavenly city, or the, quote, flower of the sea in which Christ lies hidden, unquote. In a word, as a mandala. This, according to the tantric idea of the lotus, is feminine, and for the readily understandable reasons, the lotus is the eternal birthplace of the gods. It corresponds to the western rose in which the King of Glory sits, often supported by the four evangelists who correspond to the four quarters. And I would also point out that the rose of the Rosicrucians would be the same thing, the exact same idea. From this precious piece of medieval psychology, we gain some insight into the meaning of our patient's mandala. It unites the four, and they function together harmoniously. My patient had been brought up Catholic, and thus, unwittingly, he was confronted with the same problem which caused not little worry but to old Guillaume. Excuse me. It was indeed a great problem to the Middle Ages, this problem of the Trinity and the exclusion or the very qualified recognition of the feminine element of the earth, the body, and matter in general, which were yet in the form of Mary's womb, the sacred abode of the Deity and the indispensable instrument of the divine work of redemption. My impatience vision is a symbolic answer to this age-old question. That is probably the deeper reason why the image of the world clock produced the impression of the, quote, most sublime harmony, unquote. It was the first intimation of a possible solution of the devastating conflict between matter and spirit, between the desires of the flesh and the love of God. The miserable and the ineffectual compromise of the church dream is completely overcome in this mandala vision, where all opposites are reconciled. If we hark back to the old Pythagorean idea, here we go, that the soul is a square, exactly, God, there's so many connections. Then the mandala would express the deity through its threefold rhythm and the soul through its static quaternity, the circle divided into four colors, and thus, in its innermost meaning, would simply be the union of the soul with God. And let us not forget, guys, that the book, The Social History of Kamrupa, i.e., the Phoenicians in India and the Assyrians and Aryans in India, they come from the Himalayas originally, and they came south. So, these Phoenician, I don't know what you would say, their ancestors, which were also Pythagorean. They and the ones that started their Shiva and Shakti worship, they already dealt in these kinds of things, these mandalas and these mathematical ideas, which was eventually passed on and carried on by Pythagoras himself. I don't even think he necessarily invented it, I think he was given this information and then took it another step forward. So just keep that in mind, because this is the abstract ideas of how these people use. I mean, they're really brilliant when you really think about it. They are able to abstractly come up with these ideas of God and the separation between matter and divinity, and put it into these ideas of sacred geometry, so to speak, and numbers and some of these ideas. So I think it's pretty cool, pretty different. And I gotta say that the people of the past were certainly not idiots, at least the educated ones, not the quote unquote profane. Okay, continuing. As the world clock also represents the quadratura circuli and the perpetua mobile, both these preoccupations of the medieval mind find an adequate expression in our mandala. The golden circle and its contents represents the quaternity in the form of the four kabiri and the four colors, and the blue circle represents the trinity and the movement of time, according to Guillaume. In our case, the hand of the blue circle has the fastest movement, while the golden circle moves slowly, whereas the blue circle seems to be somewhat incongruous in Guillaume's golden heaven. The circles, in our case, are harmoniously combined. The trinity is now the life, the quote-unquote pulse of the whole system, with a threefold rhythm based, however, on 32, a multiple of 4. Huh. How about that? I guess I understood that, but I didn't really think of it that way, huh? Pardon me. That puts a whole new thing with the that puts a whole new thing with the whole Freemasonry squaring the circle, the 32, and it being a division of 4. How interesting. And continuing, sorry. This agrees with the view I expressed before that the quaternity is the sine qua non of divine birth and consequently of the inner life of the Trinity. Thus, circle and quaternity on one side and the threefold rhythm on the other interpenetrate so that each is contained in the other. There you go. In Guillaume's version of the Trinity, it's obvious enough, but the quaternity is concealed in the duality of the king and queen of heaven. Exactly. What is more, the blue color does not belong to the queen, but to the calendar, which represents time, and it's characterized by Trinitarian attributes. There seems to be a mutual interpretation of symbols, just as in our case. Interpenetrations of qualities and contents are typical not only of symbols in general, but also of the essential similarity of the contents symbolized. Without this similarity, no interpenetration would be possible at all. We therefore find an interpenetration also in the Christian conception of the Trinity, where the Father appears in the Son in the Father, and the Holy Ghost in Father and Son, or both these in the Holy Ghost as the Paraclete. The progression from Father to Son and the Son's appearance on earth at a particular moment would represent the time element, while the spatial element would be personified by the Mater Dei. Oh, excuse me while I rub my itchy eye. Oh, excuse me. So the Mater Dei, the mother quality, was originally an attribute of the Holy Ghost and later was known as the Sophia Sapientia by certain Christians. This feminine quality could not be completely eradicated. It still adheres to the symbol of the Holy Ghost, the Columba Spiritus Sancti. And this is true, is that the Holy Ghost is considered a feminine energy, so to speak. But the quaternity is entirely absent from the dogma. Though it appears in early ecclesiastical symbolism, I refer to the cross with the equal arms enclosed in the circle, the triumphant Christ with the four evangelists, the tetramorph, and so on. In later ecclesiastical symbolism, the Rosa Mystica, there you go, Rosicrucians, guys, the vas devotionis, the fons signatus, and the hortus conclusus appear as attributes of the mater dei, and of the spiritualized earth. It would hardly be worthwhile to look at all these relationships in a psychological light if the conceptions of the Trinity were nothing more than the ingenuities of human reason. I have always taken the view that they belong to the type of revelation to which Kopkin has recently given the name of, quote, gnosis, unquote, not to be confused with Gnosticism. Revelation is a, quote, unveiling, unquote, of the depths of the human soul, first and foremost, a, quote, laying bare, unquote. Hence, it is essentially an essentially psychological event, though this does not, of course, tell us what else it might be. That lies outside the province of science. My view comes very close to Kopin's lapidary formula, which moreover bears the ecclesiastical imprimatur, quote, the Trinity is a revelation not only of God, but at the same time of man, unquote. Very, very true. Our mandala is an abstract, almost mathematical representation of some of the main problems discussed in medieval Christian philosophy. Isn't that what I just said a couple minutes ago? The abstraction goes so far indeed that if it had not been for the help of Guillaume's vision, we might have overlooked its widespread system of roots in human history. Indeed, the patient did not possess any real knowledge of the historical material. You know what I'm going to say? Just stop for a quick second. I'm also going to say on this, overlooked its widespread system of roots in human history. This is very important, here, because this is very true, and this is something that even early on in Christianity, there were all kinds of arguments, ecclesiastical arguments, and I mean, they even murdered thousands of people because they didn't agree with each other on this kind of stuff. But the entire idea of the cross, and also this whole idea of this abstraction, and how all of this is done in this sort of mandala, this kind of abstraction of numbers and shapes, and I think it's very interesting, and this is a very great point, because long before Christianity ever ended up on the scene, these were already concepts that were already understood by antiquity, so to speak. Anyways, continuing. The patient did not possess any real knowledge of the historical material. He knew only what anybody who had received a smattering of religious instruction in early childhood would know, which I would say that is a lot of people out there. A massive amount of people out there do have a smattering of religious instruction, and that's about it. And because they don't understand things, they easily throw it off to the side, which I think is a shame. He himself saw no connection between his world clock and any religious symbol. One can readily understand this, since the vision contains nothing at first sight that should remind anyone of religion. Yet the vision itself came shortly after the dream of the, quote, house of the gathering, unquote, and that dream was the answer to the problem of 3 and 4 represented in still an earlier dream. There it was, a matter of rectangular space, on the 4 sides of which were 4 goblets filled with colored water. One was yellow, another red, the third green, and the fourth colorless. Obviously blue was missing, yet it had been connected with the 3 other colors in a previous vision. There, where a bear appeared in the depths of a cavern, the bear had 4 eyes, emitting red, yellow, green, and blue light. Astonishingly enough, in the later dream, the blue color had disappeared. And at the same time, the customary square was transformed into an oblong, which had never appeared before. The cause of this manifest disturbance was the dreamer's resistance to the feminine element represented by the anima. In the dream of the, quote, house of the gathering, unquote, the voice confirms this fact. It says, quote, what are you doing? What you are doing is dangerous. Religion is not the tax you pay in order to get rid of the woman's image, for this image cannot be got rid of, unquote. The woman's image is exactly what we would call the anima. It is normal for a man to resist his anima because she represents, as I said before, the unconscious and all those tendencies and contents hitherto excluded from conscious life. Very interesting point. They were excluded for a number of reasons, both real and apparent. Some are suppressed and some are repressed, and as a rule, those tendencies that represent the antisocial elements in man's psychic structure, what I call the statistical criminal, quote unquote, in everybody are suppressed. That is, they are consciously and deliberately disposed of. But tendencies that are merely repressed are usually of a somewhat doubtful character. They are not so much antisocial as unconventional and socially awkward. The reason why we repress them is equally doubtful. Some people repress them from sheer cowardice, others from conventional morality, and others again for reasons of respectability. Repression is a sort of half-conscious, half-hearted letting go of things, a dropping of hotcakes or a reliving of grapes which hang too high, or a looking the other way in order not to become conscious of one's desires. Freud discovered that repression is one of the main mechanisms in making of a neurosis. Suppression amounts to a conscious moral choice, but repression is a rather immoral quote-unquote penchant for getting rid of disagreeable decisions. Suppression may cause worry, conflict, and suffering, but it never causes a neurosis. Neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. Interesting. Let me just double check, guys, to make sure that that the sound is coming through okay, because sometimes, yeah, it seems good. Okay. All right, so getting back to it. Sorry for the. There we go. If one discounts the statistical criminal, quote unquote, there still remains the vast domain of inferior qualities and primitive tendencies which belong to the psychic structure of the man who is less ideal and more primitive than we would like to be, than we should like to be. We have certain ideas as to how a civilized or educated or moral being should live, and we occasionally do our best to fulfill these ambitious expectations. But since nature has not bestowed the same blessings upon each of her children, some are more or less, others less gifted. Excuse me. Let me take a quick sip. There are people who can just afford to live properly and respectably, that is to say, no manifest flaw is discoverable. They either commit minor sins, if they sin at all, or their sins are concealed from them by a thick layer of unconsciousness. And, just so you guys understand, the word sin actually just means to miss the mark, if you didn't know that already. So, one is rather inclined to be lenient with sinners who are unconscious of their sins, but nature is not at all lenient with unconscious sinners. She punishes them just as severely as they had committed a conscious offense. Thus, we find, as the pious Henry Drummond once observed, that it is that it is highly moral people unaware of their other side who develop particularly hellish moods which make them insupportable to their relatives. Oh my God. I've come across so many people like this. That's such a true statement. The odor of sanctity may be far reaching, but to live with a saint might well cause an inferiority complex or even a wild outburst of immorality in individuals less morally gifted. Morality seems to be a gift like intelligence. You cannot pump it into a system to which it is not indigenous. What a great point. Unfortunately, there can be no doubt that man is, on the whole, less good than he imagines himself or wants to be. Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. If an inferiority is conscious, one always has a chance to correct it. Furthermore, it is constantly in contact with other interests, so that it is continually subjected to modifications. But if it is repressed and isolated from the consciousness, it never gets corrected, and is liable to burst forth suddenly in a moment of unawareness. At all events, it forms an unconscious snag, blocking the most well-meant attempts. This is such a great point here, you guys. And this is how some psychologists and psychology, or what you would call behavior psychology, really comes into play. Because there's a lot of I don't know how you would say, there's stuff that is under our conscious understanding. Excuse me. That become almost like knee-jerk reactions in which something happens and we react and we don't know why or how or even can control the level of reaction, which is why some people really out of nowhere just have these crazy outbursts of emotion. when you simply say something or you just don't do something or whatever else. And we all have them. Not a single one of us doesn't have them. So, but it's an important thing, and it's not an impossibility to work on those things on yourself. You just have to recognize when those things are, playing themselves out in you, and understand that that might not be your conscious choice to react that way, and you're just doing it because that's what you learned as a child and as growing up from other people, from the people that you grow up with, that you learn from, that you observe, all that kind of stuff. Anyways, continuing, I might do a video on that whole subject at some point. We carry our past with us, to wit, the primitive and inferior man with his desires and emotions, and it is only with an enormous effort that we can detach ourselves from this burden. Exactly. If it comes to a neurosis, we invariably have to deal with a considerable intensified shadow. And if such a person wants to be cured, it is necessary to find a way in which his conscious personality and his shadow can live together. Well put, Dr. Jung. Pardon me. This is a very serious problem for all those who themselves in such a predicament, who are themselves in such a predicament or have to help sick people back to normal life. Mere suppression of the shadow is as little of a remedy as beheading would be for a headache. To destroy a man's morality does not help either, because it would kill his better self, without which even the shadow makes no sense. The reconciliation of these opposites is a major problem, and even in the antiquity it bothered certain minds. Thus we know of another otherwise legendary personality of the 2nd century, Carpocrates, a Neoplatonist philosopher whose school, according to Irenaeus, taught that good and evil are merely human opinions, and that the soul, that before its departure from the body, must pass through the whole gamut of human experience to the very end if it is not to fall back into the prison of the body. Whoa. That goes a lot. This is very similar to what Oregon was saying in my video that I did about reincarnation in Christianity, and those early ideas. It's very, very similar to that, because that is kind of the case. And you see that in Buddhism as well, and I believe in Hinduism too. But it's this idea that this is part of the experience. You can't get away from it. So why would you run away from it? Why not just have courage and face your problems, instead of trying to bury it or bury your head in the sand or run away from it as much as you can, because it'll always catch up with you. So, but yeah, the prison of the body. Interesting. Continuing. It is as if the soul could only ransom itself from imprisonment in the somatic world of the demiurge by complete fulfillment of all life's demands. Again, this actually goes along with my video on Christianity, reincarnation, Christianity, and also it goes along with, I believe part 1 was Jesus a Phoenician, and the discussion, that short discussion of the demiurge and Yahweh being a demiurge and not actually actual God itself, but part of that that duality, the emanating duality that creates the illusion of our world here. Anyways, believe what you guys want to believe, whatever. Continuing, the bodily existence in which we find ourselves is a kind of hostile brother whose conditions must be first be known. If it was this sense that the Carpocratians interpreted Matthew 5:25, also Luke 12:58, quote, agree with thine adversary quickly, whilst thou art in the way with him, lest at any time the adversary deliver thee to judge, and the judge deliver thee to the officer, and thou be cast into prison. Verily I say unto thee, thou shalt be by no means come out thence till thou hast paid the uttermost farthing. Wow. I'd have to go back and take a look at this in the Aramaic Bible. This is obviously King James. People love the King James Bible. I cannot stand the King James Bible. Here, continuing, remembering the other Gnostic doctrine that no man can be redeemed from a sin he has not committed, we are here confronted with a problem of the very greatest importance. obscured through it is by the Christian abhorrence of anything Gnostic, inasmuch as the somatic man, the quote-unquote adversary, and what a quote that was, guys. I don't think I was even aware of that. I think I might have been when I first read it, but I'm going to have to go back and do another whole video on reincarnation in Christianity, because I have a heck of a lot more information to bring to you guys, but this is a great quote to add on to that video. So going back here, inasmuch as the somatic man, the adversary, is none other than the other in me, right? So your ego versus your divine self, your physical versus your divine self. It is plain that the capocration mode of thought would lead to the following interpretation of Matthew 5:22f. Quote, "But I say unto you that whoever is angry with himself without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. And whoever shall say to himself, Raka, shall be in danger of the council. But whoever shall say, Thou fool, shall be in danger of hellfire. Therefore, if thou bring thy gift to the altar, and there rememberest that thou hast aught against thyself, leave there thy gift before the altar, and go thy way. First be reconciled to thyself, and then come and offer thy gift. Agree with thyself quickly whilst thou art in the way with thyself, lest at any time thou deliverest thyself to the judge." Unquote. There's some juicy stuff here, you guys. Man. From here it is but a step to the uncanonical saying, quote, "Man, if indeed thou knowest that thou doest, thou art blessed. But if thou knowest not, thou art cursed, and a transgressor of the law." Unquote. Well, I wonder which law he's talking about. But the problem comes very close indeed in the parable of the unjust steward, which is a stumbling block in more senses than one. Quote, "And the Lord commanded the unjust steward because he had done wisely." Luke 16:8. In the Vulgate, the word for wisely is prudenter, and in Greek the text is whatever that is, prudently, sensibly, intelligently. I wonder what I'm curious because I have the Aramaic Bible, which obviously has a ton of different versions of lines. I wonder what it says there. There is no denying that the practical intelligence functions here as a court. Let me go back. There's no denying that the practical intelligence functions here as a court of ethical decision. Perhaps despite Irenaeus, who I'm not a big fan of, we may credit the Capocratians with this much insight, and allow that they too, like the unjust steward, were commendably aware of how to save face. It is natural that the more robust mentality of the Church Fathers could not appreciate the delicacy and the merit of this subtle and, from a modern point of view, immensely practical argument. It was also dangerous, and it is still the most vital and yet the most ticklish ethical problem of a civilization that has forgotten why man's life should be sacrificial, that is, offered up to an idea greater than himself. Man can live the most amazing things if they make sense to him, but the difficulty is to create that sense. It must be a conviction naturally, but you find that the most convincing things man can invent are cheap and ready-made and are never able to convince him against his personal desires and fears. Which brings me back to the whole Sancho Niato cosmology of the Phoenicians in the very end of that, of those, or at least of the version that survives. Talks about the mystical sacrifice of the Phoenicians, which is very interesting and very much like what they're talking about here. If the repressed tendencies, the shadow as I call them, were obviously evil, there would be no problem whatever, but the shadow is merely something inferior, primitive, unadapted, and awkward. Not wholly bad if it contains childish or primitive qualities which would in a way vitalize and embellish human existence, but it is, quote, not done, unquote. The educated public, the flower of our present civilization, has detached itself from its roots, and it is about to lose its connection with the earth as well. There is no civilized country nowadays where the lowest strata of the population are not in a state of unrest and dissent. Oh, God. And nothing, it hasn't much changed since then, my friend.
In a number of European nations, such a condition is overtaking the upper strata too. This state of affairs demonstrates our psychological problem on a gigantic scale. And this is coming to the heart of, truly to the heart of how they can sway masses of people and, let's say, brainwash masses of people to do what they want. Inasmuch as the collectivities are mere accumulations of individuals, their problems are accumulations of individual problems. One set of people identifies itself with a superior man and cannot descend, and the other set identifies itself with inferior man and wants to get to the top. Huh. Doesn't that sound like the same old elite and the 1% versus the rest of us? It's very interesting. But in just a simple psychological way and connecting with all of this other stuff. I mean, here it is. These very simple ideas, guys, that play itself out over and over again in history, and again playing itself again, not even through religion, but through secularism, but they're using the same terminology and the same ideas, and they are quote unquote secular societies by eliminating this whole divinity of our of our understanding and our education system and replacing it with just abject materialism. But yet we still have the same problems as Dr. Jung here has very astutely laying out for all of us. And I think we should all take a step back and think about this in our current predicament. Continuing, such problems are never solved by legislation or by tricks. They are solved only by a general change of attitude. That is absolutely true. And the only ones that are going to be changing the attitude are the ones that know how to mess with those buttons. So one of the reasons I started this channel, you guys, is to help people change their own attitude and change their own way of thinking with the hope that they might actually improve their lives and therefore improve the lives of those around them, creating a nice organic butterfly effect where we all help each other out one way or the other. And it doesn't have to be big, it can be very small. Continuing, and the change does not begin with propaganda and mass meetings or with violence. It begins with a change in individuals. That is exactly what I just said. It will continue as a transformation of their personal likes and dislikes, of their outlook on life and their values, and only on the accumulation of these individual changes will produce a collective solution. Holy smokes. Now, think about, and yes, I am on currently a social media platform streaming to you guys, but this social media and commercials and television and all of these things I mean, God, this paragraph right here is such a good paragraph. You guys, I hope you guys are hopefully picking up what he's really laying down here, because I mean, this is before social media became a thing. Of course, Edward Bernays is really the father of propaganda, really, and PR. It really got started during the 1930s and 20s, and this is exactly what he's using, And I've said this on many different videos in the past, is that the people at the top, they understand this, and they've understood it because this is part of that ancient wisdom that has been passed down for generations, which is why they call the rest of us people profane. They think we can't handle this information. They're wrong. We can handle this information. We can't handle it all at once, which is part of the reason why I do these audiobooks, is to give you guys little bits and pieces so that you can take this information on your own, and hopefully after a bit of time you can start to create, see the dots that I lay out for you guys, or these other authors are laying out for you guys, and connect them yourselves. Because the fact of the matter is that what's going on right now is exactly what this paragraph is telling you. And it's going on at a mass scale because we don't understand how it works. And on a religious way or on a psychological way, which is the same way. All right? Because, I mean, let's just face it, all religions of the past is just the psychology of the past. And it is a brilliant way that these people in the past, in antiquity, used things like mythology to actually create an actual psychology for the people who can't understand these abstract ideas. And it's something that I think people should respect that a little bit more, rather than looking at mythology as this pagan type of thing. It's a lot more than that. To the people, it was sort of let's say polytheistic religions, because were able to connect with these various gods for various things. But the people who were really teaching them understood that there was still monotheism, because there was always a top god underneath all of them. And then even in Christianity, you have the top god, and then you have the quote Elohim, which is plural in Hebrew, and you have all the different angels and all these other things that all play around, whatever else. It's the same thing, and it's all just to try to educate people who can't understand the higher concepts. And and then here this paragraph really just breaks down this whole idea. I mean, look, the likes and dislikes, look at that. Look how that is used right now today in social media, and how it drives people crazy. That's all I can say. I don't actually go around disliking anybody's thing, because why would I? Like, I don't care. You know what I mean? Doesn't, it's nothing to me. But it amazes me that people literally spend all day long going around typing up messages of how pissed off they are at people's videos and people's comments, and they go around, disliking everything. Hilarious. You're going to spend that much time doing that kind of stuff. You might want to think about what you're doing and why you're doing it. So, anyways, I'm sorry for the long rant, but that paragraph was really, I thought, incredible. So continuing, the educated man tries to repress the inferior man in himself, not realizing that by doing so, he forces the latter into revolt. It is characteristic of my patient that he once dreamt of a military party he wanted to, quote, to strangle the left completely, unquote. Somebody remarks that the left is weak enough anyways, but the military party answers that this is just why it ought to be strangled completely. The dream shows how my patient dealt with his own inferior man. This is clearly not the right method. The dream of the, quote, house of the gathering, unquote, on the contrary, shows a religious attitude as the correct answer to this question. The mandala seems to be an amplification of this particular point. I agree. Historically, as we have seen, the mandala served as a symbol to clarify the nature of the deity philosophically, or to represent the same thing in a visible form for the purpose of adoration, or as in the East, as a yantra for yoga practices. The wholeness, quote unquote, perfection of the celestial circle and the squareness of the earth, combining the four principles or elements of the psychic qualities, express completeness and union. And what was I just saying, you guys? This is exactly what I was just saying, Continuing, thus the mandala has the status of the, quote, uniting symbol, unquote, as the union of God and man is expressed in the symbol of Christ or the cross. We would expect the patient's world clock to have a similar reconciling significance. Prejudiced by historical analogies, we would expect a deity to occupy the center of the mandala. The center is, however, empty. The seat of the deity is unoccupied, in spite of the fact that when we analyze the mandala in terms of its historical models, we arrive at the god symbolized by the circle and the goddess symbolized by the square. How interesting. Instead of goddess, we also say earth or soul. Despite the historical prejudice, however, the fact must be insisted upon that, as in the house of the gathering, where the place of the sacred image was occupied by the quaternity, we find no trace of a deity in the mandala, but, on the contrary, a mechanism. I do not believe that we have any right to disregard such an important fact in favor of a preconceived idea. A dream or a vision is just what it seems to be. It is not a disguise for something else. It is a natural product, which is precisely a thing without ulterior motive. Oh man, guys. One of these days, I'm going to share with you the story of one of the only times I ever actually had a waking vision. And this particular sentence really encapsulates the whole point of the vision I had, because it's and a natural product, which is precisely a thing without ulterior motive. It was there to just show me something, and whether or not I paid attention to it was up to me. But I paid attention to it, and boy, did it change things in my life and in someone else's drastically. But it helped me understand something about everything that we're actually reading here in this quaternity and all these other things. And one day I'll get into that. And when we get personal, I'll probably call it "Let's Get Personal," and then do subtitles. Excuse me. Excuse me. I have been I have seen many hundreds of mandalas done by patients who were quite uninfluenced, and I have found the same fact in an overwhelming majority of cases. There was never a deity occupying the center. The center, as a rule, is emphasized, but what we find there is a symbol with a very different meaning. It is a star, a sun, a flower, a cross with equal arms, a precious stone, a bowl filled with water or wine, a serpent coiled up, or a human being, but never a god. How interesting. When we find triumphant Christ in the rose window of a medieval church, again, Rosicrucianism, here we go, guys. This just goes to show you that there might be something to Rosicrucianism. If you guys haven't checked out my audiobook, or if you don't want to read or listen to the audiobook, all the audiobooks should have a link to the book itself, the Rosicrucianism and their teaching, and also the related Philosophy of Fire book, which was written by the same gentleman. A lot of that has to do with a lot of this, but in their point of view. When we find a triumphant Christ in the rose window of a medieval church, we rightly assume that this must be a central symbol of the Christian cult. At the same time, we assume that any religion which is rooted in the history of a people is as much expression of their psychology as the form of political government, for instance, that the people have developed. Period. If we apply the same method to the modern mandalas that people have seen in dreams or visions or have developed through, quote, active imagination, unquote, we reach the conclusion that mandalas are expressions of a certain attitude which cannot help calling, quote unquote, religious. Religion is a relationship to the highest or most powerful value, be it positive or negative. The relationship is voluntary as well as involuntary. That is to say, you can accept consciously the value by which you are possessed unconsciously. That psychology, or that psychological fact which wields the greatest power in your system, functions as a god, since it is always the overwhelming psychic factor that is called, quote unquote, God. As soon as a god ceases to be an overwhelming factor, he dwindles to a mere name. Isn't that the truth? His essence is dead and his power is gone. Why did the gods of antiquity lose their prestige and their effect on the human soul? Because the Olympians had served their time and a new mystery began. God became man. Interesting. If we allow ourselves to draw conclusions from modern mandalas, we should ask people first whether they worship stars, suns, flowers, and snakes. They will deny this, and at the same time, they will assert that the globes, stars, crosses, and the like are symbols for a center in themselves. And if asked what they mean by the center, they will begin to stammer and to refer to this or that experience, which may turn out to be something very similar to the confession of my patient, who found that the very vision of his world clock had left him with a wonderful feeling of perfect harmony. Others will confess that a similar vision came to them in a moment of extreme pain or profound despair. Yep, and that's when my vision came. Extreme pain and profound despair. And man, did it fix things in ways that I can't even explain. But I will try to make an attempt soon, okay? Because I think that's an important personal story for me to share with you guys, because it's one that every person can have and has the possibility of having if you only open yourself up to some interesting ideas. So continuing, to others, again, it is the memory of a sublime dream or of a moment when long and fruitless struggle comes to an end and a reign of peace began. Indeed. If you sum up what people tell you about their experiences, you can formulate it this way. They came to themselves, they would accept themselves, they were able to become reconciled to themselves, and thus were reconciled to adverse circumstances and events. It is almost like what used to be expressed by saying, he has made peace with God. Oh my God, this is so good. He has sacrificed his own will, he has submitted himself to the will of God. A modern mandala is an involuntary confession of a peculiar mental condition. There is no deity in the mandala, nor is there any submission or reconciliation to a deity. The place of the deity always seems to be taken by the wholeness of man. Exactly, the divinity within all of us. When that's me saying this, not the book. When one speaks of man, everyone means his own ego personality. That is, his personality so far as he is conscious of it. And when one speaks of one assumes that they have a very similar personality. What a great term here that he just laid out for you guys. So our physical life, our physical expression as who we think we are, encapsulated by our body, by our shell here. This is this ego personality. And then we have our divine personality, which is an infinite part of ourselves. It cannot die, goes through reincarnation to learn its lessons until it doesn't need to, and then it moves on. It doesn't mean that its lessons are over, but it certainly is an aspect of this. So we have our ego personality, and it's one that you should come to terms with and understand, because you won't be able to understand the divine side of yourself if you don't understand the ego personality side of yourself, which is the only thing that has ever taught you your whole life. That's why the divine part of people is so scary to so many people, because you really have to break yourself down, so to speak, and psychologically, spiritually, in a way that it can be very scary, because you actually have to face the things that you've done in your life and the kind of person that you've become. And also realize that you don't, from that point on, have to continue being that way, or living that way, or thinking that way, or choosing to do certain things. It can be a conscious choice instead of an unconscious reaction and an unconscious control. So I think that's something that defines different people who really do wake up and aren't nasty, evil people, because they know there's no point in it anymore. Anyways, I'm sorry for the rant, continuing. But since modern research has acquainted us with the fact that individual consciousness is based on and surrounded by an indefinitely extended unconscious psyche, exactly what I'm just saying, the ego, right? We must needs revise our somewhat old-fashioned prejudice that man is nothing but his consciousness. This naive assumption must be confronted at once with the critical question, whose consciousness? Good question. The fact is, it would be a difficult task to reconcile the picture I have of myself with the one which other people have of me. Who is right, and who is the real individual? Very good question indeed. If we go further and consider the fact that man is also what neither he himself nor other people know of him, an unknown something which can yet be proved to exist, the problem of identity becomes more difficult still. Indeed, it is quite impossible to define the extent and the ultimate character of psychic existence. When we now speak of man, we mean the indefinable whole of him, the ineffable totality. Oh boy, which can only be formulated symbolically. This is great, guys. I love this stuff. I have chosen the term, quote unquote, self to designate the totality of man, the sum total of conscious and unconscious contents. I have chosen this term in accordance with Eastern philosophy, which for centuries has occupied itself with the problems that arise when even the gods cease to incarnate. The philosophy of the Upanishads corresponds to a psychology that long ago recognized the relativity of the gods. This is not to be confused with a stupid error like atheism. The world is as it ever has been, but our consciousness undergoes peculiar changes. First, in remote times, which can still be observed among primitives living today, the main body of psychic life was apparently in human and in non-human objects. It was projected, as we should say now. My goodness. And this goes into the whole idea of, forget it. Maybe I'll get to that thought later. Consciousness can hardly exist in a state of complete projection. At most, it would be a heap of emotions. Through the withdrawal of projections, the conscious knowledge slowly developed. Science, curiously enough, began with the discovery of astronomical laws, and hence with the withdrawal, so to speak, of the most distant projections. God, this is so good. That was the first stage in the despiritualization of the world. Interesting. One step followed another. Already in antiquity, the gods were withdrawn from mountains and rivers, from trees and animals. Oh, God, exactly. And it's very interesting, too, because I can't remember the exact quote in my mind, but it's something to the extent of, look in the river, look under a rock, and and you find me. Look into the trees, and it screams my name, as I believe Jesus said. It's the same idea here, guys. It's the same idea under Christianity, but this is one of much older antiquarian idea, but it's the same thing. It's that divinity exists all over. It's all part of the projections, quote unquote, the holographic universe, if you will, which blows my mind that some people can believe in that kind of idea but still not believe in God. Very strange. But anyways, continuing. Modern science has subtilized its projections to an almost unrecognizable degree. I agree with that. But our ordinary life still swarms with them. You can find them spread out in the newspapers, in books, rumors, and ordinary social gossip. All gaps in our actual knowledge are still filled out with projections. Indeed, we are still so sure we know what other people think or what their true character is. We are convinced that certain people have all the bad qualities we do not know in ourselves, or that they practice all those vices which could, of course, never be our own. Doesn't that sound like politics, guys? Yeah. Republicans versus Democrats, the left versus the right, the age-old game of divide and conquer, which is completely ridiculous. This is why I've been an independent my entire life. Continuing, we must still be exceedingly careful not to project our own shadows too shamelessly. I couldn't have put this better. We are still swamped with projected illusions. If you imagine someone who is brave enough to withdraw all these projections, then you get an individual who is conscious of a considerable shadow. Such a man has saddled himself with new problems and conflicts. He has become a serious problem to himself. He is now unable to say that they do this or that. They are wrong and they must be fought against. He lives in the, quote, house of gatherings, unquote. Such a man knows that the answer is wrong in the world, that such a man knows that whatever is wrong in the world is in himself. And if he only learns to deal with his own shadow, he has done something real for the world. I wish I could just clap, but wow. This is a lesson I learned a long time ago. This is something I constantly practice every single day since I've learned it, because it has absolutely helped me in every possible way deal with my problems, give me peace, give me happiness, despite all the nastiness of this world. I hope this is something that you guys can appreciate, because this is really, I'm going to read this again because this is so good. Okay? This is all about turning inwards and realizing that you can't keep pointing your finger outwards, because when you're pointing yourself outwards, you have three fingers pointing back at you. Remember that, all right? You have to look at your own shadow. You have to look at those things. You have to face yourself. It's not as difficult as you might think it is. It is difficult, but once you do, and once you understand and you feel and you experience this, it is one of the most liberating experiences you will ever have. And I'm, and I'm not, I don't know how you say it, but I'm definitely not over exaggerating or under exaggerating with that. The things that's changed for me, and the thing that's changed for the people in my life and the people around me, is incredible. I've changed the direction of people's lives just with these kinds of concepts and living this way. But it took me a hell of a long time to wrap my head around this. I'm talking 20 something years of not just learning, but experiencing and stumbling and making mistakes. That's all part of it. So, anyways, such a man knows that whatever is wrong in the world is in himself, and he only learns to deal with his own shadow. He has done something real for the world. He has succeeded in shouldering at least an infinitesimal part of the gigantic, unsolved social problems of our day. These problems are mostly so difficult because they are poisoned by mutual projections. Oh my God. This is so good, guys. Ugh. How can anyone see straight when he does not even see himself in the darkness he consciously carries with him into all his dealings? Modern psychological development leads to much better understanding as to what man really consists of. The gods at first lived in superhuman power and beauty on top of snow-clad mountains or in the darkness of caves, woods, and seas. Later on, they drew together in one god, and then that god became man. In our day, even the god-man seems to have descended from his throne to be dissolving himself into the common man. This is probably why his seat is empty. Instead, the common man suffers from a hubris, I guess. This is hybris, but I don't know. Hubris of consciousness that borders on the pathological. Oh yeah, it's hubris. This psychic condition is the individual course, and the psychic condition in the individual corresponds by and large to the hypertrophy and the totalitarian pretensions of the idealized state. Wow. Talk about hitting the nail on the head. In the same way that the state has caught the individual imagines that he has caught the psyche and holds her in the hollow of his hand. He is even making a science of her, and the absurd supposition that the intellect, which is but a part and a function of the psyche, is sufficient to comprehend the much greater whole. In reality, the psyche is the mother and the maker, the subject, and even the possibility of consciousness itself. It reaches far beyond the boundaries of consciousness, that the latter would easily be compared to an island in the ocean. Whereas the island is small and narrow, the ocean is immensely wide and deep, and contains a life infinitely surpassing, in kind and degree, anything known on the island. So that if it is a question of space, it does not matter whether the gods are quote unquote inside or quote unquote outside. It might be objected that there is no proof that consciousness is nothing more than an island in the ocean. Certainly it is impossible to prove this, since the known range of consciousness is confronted with the unknown extension of the unconscious, of which we only know that it exists, and by the very fact of its existence exerts a limiting influence on consciousness and its freedom. Wherever unconsciousness reigns, there is a bondage and possession. Exactly. The immensity of the ocean is simply a comparison. It expresses in allegorical form the capacity of the unconscious to limit and threaten consciousness. The empirical psychology loved, until recently, to explain the quote-unquote unconscious as mere absence of consciousness. The term itself indicates as much, just as shadow is an absence of light. Today, accurate observations of unconscious process has recognized with all other ages before us that the unconscious possesses a creative autonomy such as mere shadow could never be endowed with. When Karus von Hartmann, and in a sense Schopenhauer, equated the unconscious with the world-creating principle, they were only summoning up those teachings of the past which, grounded in inner experience, saw the mysterious agent personified as the gods. Exactly what I was saying earlier. Excuse me for a minute while I just take a quick sip. It suits our hypertrophied and hubristic modern consciousness not to be mindful of the dangerous autonomy of the unconscious and to treat it negatively as an absence of consciousness. The hypothesis of invisible gods or demons would be psychologically a far more appropriate formulation, even though it would be an anthropomorphic projection. I absolutely agree with this 100%. And this is a problem with a lot of Christians and, well, let's just say a lot of people of Abrahamic faiths have, is that they anthropomorphize demons and angels and the devil on these things, and without actually facing that part of themselves, which is what the whole purpose of those things are meant to represent, they then make them an external power, which then after that they're not responsible for taking care of anymore. So it is what it is. But since the development of consciousness requires the withdrawal of all projections we can lay our hands on, it is not possible to maintain any non-psychological doctrine about the gods. I agree with that. Yeah, it is not possible to maintain any non-psychological doctrine about the gods. That is 100% correct in what I was saying earlier, guys, which is one of the reasons I'm reading this out to you guys. So people can really understand that the old polytheism is not what people are making it out to be. And unfortunately, a lot of people have made the profane, quote-unquote, mistake of seeing it that way. If the historical process of the world despiritualization continues as hitherto, then everything of a divine or demonic nature outside us must return to the psyche, to the inside of the unknown man whence it apparently originated, which has now been replaced by psychological drugs. Instead of actually facing ourselves and understanding ourselves and all these things, let's just get you on drugs, which will drastically rewire your entire system. And then if you want to get off of them, forget about it. It's going to take you 3 months. Or it'll make you crazy, or it'll make you have suicidal thoughts, or it'll make you whatever, have thoughts of violence. I mean, this is what these, and not Jung, because Jung's psychotherapy and his, let's say his part of that is not the part that prescribes you drugs and tries to lobotomize you chemically. And it is one of the most horrible things that this psychiatry has really truly done to the people on this planet. And I've found it really horrible and disgusting. And I'm sorry if some of you guys do take psychological drugs. This is not a judgment on you at all. But I would suggest that maybe try to look inside and try to put those things away, because they really are dangerous. Anyways, continuing from my rant. The materialistic error, exactly, the materialistic error was probably unavoidable at first, since the throne of God cannot be discovered among the galactic systems. The inference was that God never existed. The second unavoidable error is psychologism. If God is anything, he must be an illusion derived from certain motives, from will to power, for instance, from repression, from repressed sexuality, which sounds like something out of Freud, which I don't really like Freud that much. These arguments are not new. Much the same thing was said by the Christian missionaries who withdrew the idols of the heathen gods. But whereas the early missionaries were conscious of serving a new god by combating the old ones, modern iconoclasts are unconscious of the one in whose name they are destroying old values. Nietzsche thought himself quite conscious and responsible when he smashed the old tablets, yet he felt a peculiar need to back himself up with revivified Zarathustra, a sort of alter ego with whom he often identifies himself in his great tragedy, Thus Spake Zarathustra. Nietzsche, who was no atheist, but his God was dead. The result of this demise was a split in himself, and he felt compelled to call the other self Zarathustra, or at times Dionysus. In his fatal illness, he signed his letters Zagreus, the dismembered god of the Thracians. The tragedy of Zarathustra is that because his god died, Nietzsche himself became a god, and this happened because he was no atheist. He was of too positive a nature to tolerate the urban neurosis of atheism. It seems dangerous for such a man to assert that, quote, God is dead, unquote. He instantly becomes the victim of inflation. Far from being a negation, God is actually the strongest and most effective, quote unquote, position the psyche can reach, in exactly the same sense in which Paul speaks of people, quote, whose God is their belly, unquote. I guess which is, I forget what letter this is. The strongest and therefore the decisive factor in any individual psyche compels the same belief or fear, submission or devotion which a god would demand from man. Anything despotic and inescapable is the sense, quote unquote, God, and it becomes absolute unless by an unethical decision freely chosen, one succeeds in building up against this natural phenomenon a position that is equally strong and invincible. If this psychic position proves to be absolutely effective, it surely deserves to be named, quote unquote, God, and what is more, a spiritual God, since it sprang from the freedom of ethical decision and therefore from the mind. Man is free to decide whether God shall be a spirit or a natural phenomenon like the craving of a morphine addict, and hence whether God shall act as a beneficent or a destructive force. However, indubitable and clearly understandable these psychic events or decisions may be, they are very apt to lead people to the false, unpsychological conclusion that it rests with them to decide whether they will create a god for themselves or not. There is no question of that, since each of us is equipped with a psychic disposition that limits our freedom in high degree and makes it practically illusory. And I agree. Because what is freedom, right? Just like the question is, what is love? You can try to define it, but you have to define it within a certain framework. And then within that framework is not definable in another framework. So keep that in mind. Not only is quote unquote, freedom of the will, unquote, an incalculable problem philosophically, it is also a misnomer in the practical sense, for we seldom find anybody who is not influenced and indeed dominated by desires, habits, impulses, prejudices, resentments, and by every conceivable kind of complex. Exactly. All these natural facts function exactly as an Olympus full of deities who want to be appropriated, served, feared, worshipped, and not only by the individual owner of this assorted pantheon, but by everybody in his vicinity. Bondage and possession are synonymous. Always, therefore, there is something in the psyche that takes possession and limits or suppresses our moral freedom. And I mean, come on, guys, look at this. This is exactly what I was saying to you earlier. All these natural facts function exactly like an Olympus full of deities who want to be appropriated, served, feared, worshipped, not only by the individual owner of this assorted pantheon, but by everybody in his vicinity, which is essentially saying the exact same thing here. It is also a misnomer in the practical sense, for we seldom find anybody who is not influenced indeed by dominated by desires, habits, impulses, prejudices, resentments, and by every conceivable kind of complex. This is why you have these gods that represent just the various parts of humanity. This is one of the biggest problems about how people understand quote unquote paganism and polytheism. This is what, he is explaining this in better ways than I could ever explain this, but it's funny because I came to all these conclusions differently. But this is all absolutely true. And this is why you have gods like Narcissus, who represents being a narcissist, and various other things. All kinds of different gods that represents just different parts of humanity. Again, to help people understand the human condition. But in essence, you can look past all those things and see them for what they are, and actually, what your true freedom is, or your true freedom of the will, so to speak, can be much more understood because you're not a slave to the habits, desires, impulses, prejudices, resentments, and I would say preconceived notions and also preconceived reactions in which we all get and learn when we grow up. This is why people are just like their parents. This is why when people get angry just like their parents and their sisters and their brothers and their cousins and their grandparents or whoever it is that you grew up with, we are very much like that because as from birth until 6, we're sponges. We absorb all these things. And after that, we turn it the other way around, and then we then act just like the people who raised us. And those things are things that aren't necessarily bad, but they are not who you are. And by looking at those things and breaking all these things down, okay, as all in all this stuff here, as I'm highlighting, those are sort of the first steps to actually having what is truly freedom of will. Because otherwise, what are you? You're just a person who is walking around with pre-programmed reactions to practically everything in life, which is why people are so angry and why things like social media, okay, and the likes and dislikes that I was talking about before work so well because they know this and they play on those buttons, okay? They understand that, and it's very easy for them to play on these buttons. And in politics, it's the same thing. They know how to play with you guys. With all of us, and they do it all the time. And the more that we're agitated, the less that we understand peace, and the less that we will actually understand freedom of will. So I'm just going to throw that out there. I'm sorry for the rant again, but continuing. In order to hide this undeniable but exceedingly unpleasant fact from ourselves, at the same time pay lip service to freedom, we have got accustomed to saying apotropaically, quote, I have such and such a desire or habit or feeling of resentment, unquote. Excuse me for a second while I take a sip. Instead of the more voracious, quote, such and such a desire or habit or feeling of a resentment has me, unquote. Yes, you see? Amazing distinction. And once you realize that it has you, then you can let it go. This is what really is meant by not having attachments, by the way. Because having attachments of love is not, yeah, you might feel bad when things, go wrong or whatever else, but at the same time, it's really the attachments that keep you down, that keep you from understanding yourself and your freedom and your peace and all these things. The latter formulation would certainly rob us even of the illusion of freedom. But I ask myself whether this would not be better in the end than fuddling ourselves with words. The truth is that we do not enjoy masterless freedom. We are continuously threatened by psychic factors which, in the guise of, quote, natural phenomenon, unquote, may take possession of us at any moment. The withdrawal of metaphysical projections leaves us almost defenseless in the face of this happening, for we immediately identify with every impulse instead of giving it the name of the quote-unquote other, which would at least hold it at arm's length and prevent it from storming the citadel of the ego. Principalities and powers, quote unquote, principalities and powers, unquote, are always with us. We have no need to create them even if we could. It is merely incumbent on us to choose the master we wish to serve, so that his service shall be our safeguard against being mastered by the quote unquote other whom we have not chosen. We do not create God, we choose him. And then there's also the famous quote, one cannot serve two masters, right? Think about that. Though our choice characterizes and defines quote-unquote God, it is always man-made, and the definition it gives is therefore infinite and imperfect. Is therefore finite and imperfect. Even the idea of perfection does not posit perfection. The definition is an image, but this image does not raise the unknown fact it designates into the realm of intelligibility. Otherwise, we would be entitled to say that we had created a God. The quote-unquote master we choose is not identical with the image we project of him in time and space. He goes on working as before, like an unknown quantity in the depths of the psyche. We do not even know the nature of the simplest thought, let alone the ultimate principles of the psyche. Also, we have no control over its inner life, but because this inner life is intrinsically free and not subject to our will and intentions, it may easily happen that the living thing chosen and defined by us will drop out of its setting, the man-made image, even against our will. Then perhaps we could say with Nietzsche, quote, God is dead, unquote. Yet it would be truer to say, quote, he has put off our image, and where shall we find him again, unquote. Interesting. The interregnum is full of danger, for the natural facts will raise their claim in the form of various isms, which are productive of nothing but anarchy and destruction, because inflation and man's hubris between them have elected to make the ego, in all its ridiculous paltriness, lord of the universe. Exactly. Oh my God, I couldn't have said that any better. That was the case with Nietzsche, the uncomprehended portent of a whole epoch. The individual ego is much too small, its brain is much too feeble to incorporate all the projections withdrawn from the world. Ego and brain burst asunder in the effort the psychiatrist calls it schizophrenia. When Nietzsche has said, quote-unquote, God is dead, he uttered a truth which is valid for the greater part of Europe. People were influenced by it not because he said so, but because it stated a widespread psychological fact. The consequences were not long delayed. After the fog of isms, the catastrophe, nobody thought of drawing the slightest conclusions from Nietzsche's pronouncement. Yet it has for some ears the same eerie sound that ancient cry which came echoing over the sea to mark the end of the nature gods, quote, great Pan is dead, unquote. Oh, wow, how interesting. The life of Christ is understood by the Church as, on the one hand, as an historical and on the other hand, as an externally existing mystery. This is especially evident in the sacrifice of the Mass. From a psychological standpoint, this view can be translated as follows. Christ lived a concrete, personal, and unique life, which, in all essential features, had at the same time an archetypal character. Which is exactly why you see so many quote-unquote Christs throughout history and in mythology and all these other things. None of them are quite the same as each other, but they all are very archetypal, very similar. Continuing, this character can be recognized from the numerous connections of the biographical details with worldwide myth motifs. These undeniable connections are the main reasons why it is so difficult for researchers in the life of Jesus to construct from the gospel reports an individual life divested of myth. In the Gospels themselves, factual reports, legends, and myths are woven into a whole. Good point. This is precisely what constitutes the meaning of the Gospels, and they would immediately lose their character of wholeness if one tried to separate the individual from the archetypal with a critical scalpel. The life of Christ is no exception in that not a few of the great figures of history have realized more or less clearly the archetype of the hero's life with its characteristic changes of fortune. But the ordinary man too unconsciously lives archetypal forms, and if these are no longer valued, it is only because of the prevailing psychological ignorance. Indeed, even the fleeting phenomenon of dreams often reveal distinctly archetypal patterns at bottom. At bottom, all psychic events are so deeply grounded in the archetype and are so much interwoven with it that in every case, considerable critical effort is needed to separate the unique from the typical with any certain or with any certainty. I completely agree with this. And one of the books we'll be reading soon, guys, will be Joseph Campbell's Hero of a Thousand Faces, because wow, what a book that is. Anyways, continuing. Ultimately, every individual life is at the same time the eternal life of the species. Wow. The individual is continuously, quote unquote, historical, because strictly time bound, the relation of the type to time, on the other hand, is irrelevant. Since the life of Christ is archetypal to a high degree, it represents to just that degree the life of the archetype. But since the archetype is the unconscious precondition of every human life, its life, when revealed, also reveals the hidden unconscious ground life of every individual. This is why, okay, that is to say that what happens in the life of Christ happens always and everywhere. In the Christian archetype, all lives of this kind are prefigured and are expressed over and over again, once and for all. And in it, too, the question that concerns us here of God's death is anticipated in perfect form. Christ himself is a typical dying and self-transforming God. And I would also just add real quick that this whole idea that is to say, what happens in life of Christ happens always and everywhere, in all people. This is what is meant by Christ consciousness. We are all potential Christs. We're also all potential devils. This is the whole idea of the quaternity. You have the divine, you have the materialistic. You know, you have the poles, the positive, the negative, the female, the male. You have all these ideas. So, continuing, the psychological situation from which we started is tantamount to why we seek, quote, why seek ye the living among the dead? He is not here, but where shall we find the risen Christ? Do not expect any believing Christian to pursue these thoughts of mine any further, for they will probably seem to him absurd. I am not, however, addressing myself to the happy to the happy possessors of faith, but to those many people for whom the light has gone out, the mystery has faded, the God is dead. For most of them there is no going back, and one does not know either whether going back is always the better way. To gain an understanding of religious matters, probably all that is left to us today is a psychological approach. That is why I take these thought forms that have become historically fixed, try to melt them down again, and pour them into molds of immediate experience. It is certainly a difficult undertaking to discover connecting links between dogma and immediate experience of psychological archetypes, but a study of the natural symbols of the unconscious gives us the necessary raw material. God's death or his reappearance is by no means only a Christian symbol. The search which follows the death is still repeated today after the death of a Dalai Lama, and in antiquity it was celebrated in the annual search for the Kore. Such a wide distribution argues in favor of the universal occurrence of this typical psychic process. The highest value which gives life and meaning has got lost. This is a typical experience that has been repeated many times, and its expression therefore occupies a central place in Christian mystery. And here you guys go, yet again, okay? Here we have another connection between the Buddhist kind of ideas and religious concepts and the Christian concepts. And also the fact that the Phoenicians, the Pani, okay, from India, the once were known Phoenicians before they were called Phoenicians, came from this part of the world. They also understood these kinds of things. They also understood these ideas between male, female, and duality, and a demiurge, and all these things. And that's why they had a God most high, one that's outside of this illusionary type of space. And I think this is very interesting. You have these motifs that run in these various different religions, even though both religions, well, at least Christianity would vehemently deny that. It's kind of hard not to see that, and unfortunately, people think, well, actually say fortunately for us, people like Carl Jung went down this path when he probably never would have done so had it not been for his own curiosity. So continuing, the death or loss must always repeat itself. Christ always dies and always he is born. There you go. This is a very simple idea of reincarnation. For the psychic life of the archetype is timeless in comparison with our individual time-boundness. According to what laws now one and now another aspect of the archetype enters into active manifestation, I do not know. I only know, and here I am expressing what countless other people know, that the present is a time of God's death and disappearance. The myth says he was not to be found where his body was laid, body meaning the outward visible form, erstwhile but ephemeral setting for the highest value. The myth further says that the value rose again in a miraculous manner. Transformed, it appears as a miracle, for when a value disappears, it always seems to be lost irretrievably. So it is quite unexpected that it should come back. The 3 days' descent into hell during death describes the sinking of the vanished value into us unconscious, whereby conquering the power of darkness, it establishes a new order and then rises up to heaven again, that is, attains supreme clarity of consciousness. The fact that only a few people see the risen one means that no small difficulties stand in the way of finding and recognizing the transformed value. I showed earlier, with the help of dreams, how the unconscious produces a natural symbol technically termed a mandala, which has the functional significance of a union of opposites or a mediation. These speculative ideas, symptomatic of an activated archetype, can be traced back to about the time of the Reformation. Oh boy, and we're going to get into that soon enough, which we find them formulated in the alchemical treatise as symbolic geometric figures which sought to express the nature of the deus terrenus, the philosopher's stone. And I've spoken a lot about that in many videos. But here again, guys, this is just another expression of math and geometry trying to explain God and not just God, but consciousness and as a whole. For instance, we read in the commentary of the Tractus Aureus, squaring of the circle, which many hitherto have sought but few have found, of this, quote, mediator, the wonderful stone, Orthelius says, quote, for as the supernatural and eternal God, for the supernatural and eternal good, Jesus Christ, our mediator and Savior, who delivered us from eternal death, from the devil, and from all evil, partakes of two natures, the divine and the human. So likewise is that earthly Savior composed of two parts, the heavenly and the earthly. With these he has restored us to health and delivered us from diseases, heavenly and earthly, spiritual and corporeal, visible and invisible, unquote. Here the Savior does not come down from heaven, but out of the depths of the earth, i.e., from which lies below consciousness. These philosophers suspect that the Spirit was imprisoned here. Hold on just a quick moment, guys. I have to do something. Give me just... Sorry about that. My wife got home, didn't realize I was recording. Okay, so these philosophers suspected that a spirit was imprisoned there, and in the vessel of matter, a quote-unquote white dove, comparable to the nous in the crater of Hermes, of which... Isn't that funny how they're all related to each other? The noose in the crater of Hermes, of which is said, plunge into this crater if thou canst, by recognizing to what end thou wast created, and by believing that thou wilt rise up to him who hath sent the crater down to earth, unquote. This nous or spirit was known as Mercurius, and it is to this arcanum that the alchemical saying refers, quote, whatever the wise seek is in Mercury, unquote. Look at that, guys. Yet again, just digging into some, old symbolism and what they actually really truly mean. And Mercury not as a god, but this idea, the spirit known as Mercurius. Okay, certainly a different way to look at that. A very ancient formula attributed to Zosimus of the legendary Ostenes runs, quote, "Go to the waters of the Nile, and there thou wilt find a stone that hath a spirit, a pneuma," unquote. A commentator explains that this refers to Quicksilver, Hydrogirion, Mercury. This spirit, coming from God, is also the cause of the, quote, greenness, unquote, the Benedicta Viridatas. Much praised by the alchemists, Milius says of it, God has breathed into created things a kind of germination, which is the viridescence. In Hildegard of Bingen's hymn to the Holy Ghost, which begins, O ignis spiritus paraclete, we read, from you the cloud rained down and the heavens move, the stones have their moisture, the waters give forth streams, and the earth sweats out great greenness. Unquote. This water of the Holy Ghost played an important role in alchemy since the remotest time as the whatever Greek word, or aqua permanens, a symbol of the spirit assimilated to matter, which according to Heraclitus turned to water. The Christian parallel was naturally Christ's blood, for which reason the water of the philosophers was named spiritualis sanguis. Let me just again put this break sign up really quickly. I want to make sure that my sound. Oh, goodness. Okay, that sounds okay. I thought for a second there. Let me just make sure that she's not using the. Sorry, she was using the tablet and that was affecting my stream here, so I apologize for that, guys. Doop. Here we go. Everything's good. All right, so the arcane substance was also known simply as the rotundum, by which was understood the anima media natura, identical with the anima mundi. The latter is a virtus die, an organ or a sphere that surrounds God. Of this, Milius says, quote, God has love all around him. Others have declared him to be an intellectual and fiery spirit, having no form, but transforming himself into whatsoever he wills, and making himself equal to all things, who by a manifold relation... let's make sure everything. Yeah, okay, good. Let's see here. Others have declared him to be an intellectual and fiery spirit, having no form, but transforming himself into whatsoever he wills, and making of himself equal to all things, who by a manifold relation is in a certain measure bound up with his creatures. This image of God, enveloped by the anima, is the same as Gregory the Great's allegory of Christ and the church. A woman shall compass a man, quote unquote. Huh, interesting. I didn't realize Gregory said that. This is in Jeremiah 31:22. This is an exact parallel to the tantric conception of Shiva and the embrace of his Shakti. And yet again, here we go, guys. This is another connection from the book of Phoenicians in India, or the social history of Kamrupa, and the fact that they started Shiva and Shakti worship. And here we go in Christianity, yet again, right here, the same idea, which should tell you that this whole connection between their, Phoenician ideas of spirituality are very close to that of Christianity. Not to mention their bread and wine that they, as part of their religious ceremonies. Anyways, continuing from this fundamental image of the male-female opposites united in the center is derived another designation of the lapis as the hermaphrodite. It is also the basis for the mandala motif. The extension of God as anima media natura into every individual creature means that there is a divine spark, the scintilla indwelling even in dead matter, in utter darkness. The medieval natural philosophers endeavored to make this spark rise up again as a divine image from the round vessel, quote unquote. Such ideas can only be based on the existence of unconscious psychic processes, for otherwise we simply could not understand how the same ideas crop up everywhere. Great point. Our dream example shows that such images are not inventions of the intellect, rather they are natural revelations, and they will probably be found again and again in exactly the same way. The alchemists themselves say that the arcanum is sometimes revealed in a dream. Sorry guys, but I got to make sure that this stream is working okay. Again, let me just double check to make sure the stream, yep, excellent condition. Sorry for the back and forth. It looks like you guys are having a lively conversation in the chat. All right, so let me go back to this. Also, I need to find out how many more pages this is. Holy smokes. Okay, 125. I'm getting there. All right, so about 10 more pages, and then I'm going to be doing this over, or finishing this up. Okay, so the old natural philosophers not only felt pretty clearly, but actually said that the miraculous substance whose essential nature they symbolized by a circle divided in 4 parts was man himself. The Enigmata Philosophorum speaks of the Homo albus, who is formed in the hermetic vessel. This quote-unquote white man is the equivalent of the priest feature in the visions of Zosimos in the Arabic transmitted quote, Book of the Kratis, unquote. We find an equally significant allusion in the dialogue between the spiritual and the worldly man, corresponding to the pneumatikos and sarkikos of the Gnostics. The spiritual man says to the worldly man, are you capable, quote, are you capable of knowing your soul in complete manner? If you knew it as is fitting, and if you knew what makes it better, you would be able to recognize that the names which the philosopher formerly gave it are not its true names. O dubious names which resemble the true names, what errors and agonies you have provoked among men, unquote. Exactly. And so, i.e., if a person, believed in polytheism, okay, and they didn't understand that they were all just a creation of an allegorical way to teach people about the human condition, that's kind of what they mean. They are unfortunately choosing to call things by their god names and believing them as that instead of looking past the symbol and what it really means. So continuing, the names refer in turn to the Philosopher's Stone, a treatise ascribed to Zosimos, though it is more likely derives from the Arabic Latinist school of literature, says unmistakably of the stone, quote, thus it comes from man, and you are its mineral, raw material, and in you it is found, and from you it is extracted, and it remains inseparably in you, unquote. Solomon Trismonosin expresses it most clearly of all, quote, study what thou art, whereof thou art a part, what thou knowest of this art, this is really what thou art. All that is without thee also is within, thus wrote Trismosin, unquote. And Gerard Dorn cries out, quote, transform yourself into living philosophical stones, unquote. Yes, indeed. There can hardly be any doubt that not a few of those seekers had the dawning knowledge that the secret nature of the stone was man's own self. Exactly. There's no, and I've gone over this before on some of this other stuff with the philosophy of fire. The philosopher's stone is nothing more than the key to spiritual and psychological understanding. That's it. This quote-unquote self was evidently never thought of as an entity identical with the ego, and for this reason is described as a hidden nature dwelling in inanimate matter as spirit, daemon, or fiery spark. Philosophy of fire, right? By means of the philosophical opus, which was mostly thought of as a mental one, this entity was freed from darkness and imprisonment, and finally it enjoyed a resurrection, often represented in the form of an apotheosis and equated with the resurrection of Christ. It is clear that these ideas can have nothing to do with the empirical ego, but are concerned with the divine nature, quite distinct from it, and hence, psychologically speaking, with a consciousness transcending content issuing from the realm of the unconscious. That is such a well-placed statement. Thank you very much, Mr. Jung. Because it's very true. The empirical ego and your divine nature are two different things. And understanding that is a big clue in understanding and finding happiness and true freedom in your life. So, continuing, with this we come back to our modern experiences. They are obviously similar in nature to the basic medieval and classical ideas and can therefore be expressed by the same, or at any rate similar symbols. The medieval representations of the circle are based on the idea of the microcosm, a concept that was also applied to the stone. The stone was a, quote, little world, unquote, like a man himself. Great, that's a great point. A sort of inner image of the cosmos, reaching not into immeasurable distances, but also into an equally immeasurable depth dimension, i.e., from the small to the unimaginably smallest. Milius therefore calls the center the, quote, punctum cordis, unquote. And this is also in a representation of the above so below type of thing, macrocosm, microcosm, divine understanding, materialism, all these different things. The experience formulated by the modern mandala is typical of people who cannot project the divine image any longer. Owing to the withdrawal and an introjection of the image, they are in danger of inflation and disassociation of the personality. The round or square enclosures built around the center therefore have the purpose of protective walls or of a vas hermeticum to prevent an outburst or a disintegration. Thus, the mandala denotes and assists exclusive concentration on the center, the self. This is anything but egocentricity. I agree. On the contrary, it is much indeed self control for the purpose of avoiding inflation and disassociation. Exactly. The enclosure, as we have seen, has also the meaning of what is called in Greek temenos, the precincts of a temple or in any isolated sacred place, which is why in the Bible it says, what is it? Your body is your temple, right? The circle in this case protects or isolates an inner content or process that should not get mixed up with things outside. Thus, the mandala repeats in symbolic form archaic ways and means by which once were concrete realities, as I have already mentioned. The inhabitant of the temenos was a god, but the prisoner or the well-protected dweller in the mandala does not seem to be a god, since the symbols used, stars, crosses, globes, etc., do not signify a god, but an obviously important part of the human personality. One might almost say that man himself or his innermost soul is the prisoner or the protected inhabitant of the mandala, i.e., the one that's trapped in this ongoing birth, death, and rebirth of reincarnation, right? Since modern mandalas are amazingly close parallels to the ancient magical circles, which usually have a deity in the center, it is clear that in the modern mandala, man, the deep ground, as it were, of the self, is not a substitute but a symbol for the deity. It is a remarkable fact that this symbol is a natural and spontaneous occurrence, and that it is always an essentially unconscious product. As our dreams show, if we want to know what happens when the idea of God is no longer projected as an autonomous entity, it is the answer of the unconscious psyche. The unconscious produces the idea of a deified or divine man who is imprisoned, concealed, protected, usually depersonalized and represented by an abstract symbol. The symbols often contain allusions to the medieval conception of the microcosm, as was the case of my patient's world clock, for instance. Many of the processes that lead to the mandala and the mandala itself seem to be direct confirmations of medieval speculation. It looks as if the patient had read those old treatises in the Philosopher's Stone, the Divine Water, the Rotundum, the Squaring of the Circle, the Four Colors, etc., and yet they have never been anywhere near alchemical philosophy and its abstruse symbolism. I hope you guys are paying attention to that. Many of these people had no connection with anything, these things at all, but yet it came out of them because it's part of what is part of all of, I think, that whole spirituality we all share. It is difficult to evaluate such facts properly. They could explain as a sort of regression to archaic ways of thinking if one's chief consideration was their obvious and impressive parallelism and medieval symbolism. But whenever such regressions occur, the result is always inferior adaptations and corresponding lack of efficiency. This is by no means typical of the psychological development depicted here. On the contrary, neurotic and disassociated conditions improve considerably and the whole personality undergoes a change for the better. For this reason, I do not think the process in question should be explained as regression, for which would amount to saying that it was a morbid condition. I am rather inclined to understand the apparent retrograde connections of mandala psychology as the continuation of a process of spiritual development which began in the early Middle Ages and perhaps even further back as early Christian times. I would suggest that it goes further back than that. There is documentary evidence that the essential symbols of Christianity were already in existence in the first century. I am thinking of the Greek treatise entitled, quote, Comerius, the archpriest, teaches Cleopatra the divine art, unquote. The text is of an Egyptian origin and bears no trace to Christian influence. There are also the mystical texts of the pseudo-Democritus and Zosimos. Jewish and Christian influences are noticeable in the last name author, though the main symbolism is Neoplatonist, and this closely connected with the philosophy of the Corpus Hermeticum. Exactly. And we'll be getting into the Corpus Hermeticum soon. You guys will see a lot of parallels there. The fact that the symbolism connected with the mandala traces its near relatives back to pagan sources casts a peculiar light upon these apparently modern psychological occurrences. They seem to continue a Gnostic trend of thought without being supported by direct tradition. If I am right, by supposing that every religion is a spontaneous expression of a certain predominant psychological condition, then Christianity was a formulation of a condition that predominated at the beginning of our era and lasted for several centuries. But a peculiar psychological condition which predominates for a certain length of time does not exclude the existence of the other psychological conditions at other times, and these are equally capable of religious expression. What a great point, guys, and this definitely buttresses what I'm saying about earlier on, is that these old religions and polytheism and whatever else really are just, Christianity is a continuation of all these things. They might change the names, they might change some of the concepts, but they're very much the same thing. Even though on the face of it, they might look different. Christianity had one time to fight for its life against Gnosticism, which, fight for its life? Are you kidding me? Which corresponds to another psychological condition. Gnosticism was stamped out completely, exactly, and its remnants are so badly mangled that special study is needed to get any insight at all into its inner meanings. So I would say this statement should be flipped around. I think Gnosticism was fighting for its life against the version of Christianity that won out. If the historical roots of our symbols extended beyond the Middle Ages, they are certainly to be found in Gnosticism. Exactly. It would not seem to me, excuse me, illogical of a psychological condition previously suppressed should reassert itself when a main idea of the suppressive condition began to lose their influence. In spite of the suppression of the Gnostic heresy, it continued to flourish throughout the Middle Ages. Under the disguise of alchemy. And, I'm going to make a case that it really never stopped, because if we do our flamenco timeline jumping around, the Gnostics and the alchemy were essentially the same thing, and they just changed their name. It is a well-known fact that the alchemy consists of two parts which complement one another. On one hand, chemical research proper, and on the other hand, theoria or philosophia, as is clear from the writings of Pseudo-Democritus in the first century, entitled something in Greek. The two aspects already belonged together at the beginning of our era. The same holds true of the Leiden papyri and writings of Zosimos in the 3rd century. The religious or philosophical views of ancient alchemy were clearly Gnostic. The later views seem to cluster around the following central idea: the anima mundi, the demiurge or divine spirit that incubated the chaotic waters of the beginning, remained in matter in the potential state, and the initial chaotic condition persisted with it. Thus, the philosophers, or the sons of wisdom, as they called themselves, took their prima materia to be part of the original chaos pregnant with spirit, and by spirit they understood as semi-material pneuma, or a sort of subtle body, which they also called volatile and identified chemically with oxides and other dissoluble compounds. They called this spirit Mercurius, which was chemically quicksilver, though Mercurius Noster was no ordinary Hg, which is Mercury. And philosophically, Hermes, the god of revelation, who, as Hermes Trismegistus, was the arch authority on alchemy. Let me just make sure everything's... Yes, okay. arch authority on alchemy. Their aim was to extract the original divine spirit out of chaos, and this extract was called the Quinta Essentia, or Aqua Permanens, or Tinctura. A famous alchemist, Johannes Rupescia, calls the quintessence, quote, la ciel humaine, unquote, the human sky or heaven. For him, it was blue liquid and incorruptible like the sky. He says that the quintessence is of the color of the sky, and, quote, our sun has adorned it as the sun adorns the sky, unquote. The sun is an allegory of gold, he says, quote, the sun is true gold, unquote. He continues, quote, these two things join together influence in us, the condition of the heaven of heavens and the heavenly sun, unquote. His idea is obviously that the quintessence, the blue sky with the golden sun in it, evokes corresponding images of the heaven and heavenly sun in ourselves. It is a picture of a blue and golden microcosm, and I take it to be a direct parallel to Guillaume's celestial vision. The colors are, however, reversed. With the rupescia, the disc is golden and the sky is blue. My patient, therefore, having a similar arrangement, seems to lean more towards the alchemical side. The miraculous liquid, the divine water called sky or heaven, probably refers to the supra-celestial waters of Genesis 1:7. In its functional aspect, it was thought to be a sort of baptismal water, which, like the holy water of the church, possesses a creative and transformative quality. The Catholic Church still performs the rite of Benedicto Fontis on Holy Saturday before Easter. The rite consists in a repetition of the Descensus Spiritus Sancti in Aquam. The ordinary water thereby acquires the divine quality of transforming and giving spiritual rebirth to man. This is exactly the alchemical idea of the divine water, and there would be no difficulty whatever in deriving the aqua permanens of alchemy from the rite of the Benedicto Fontis, were it not that the former is of a pagan origin and certainly the older of the two, but yet they're the same. We find the miraculous water mentioned in the first treatise of Greek alchemy, which belonged to the 1st century. Moreover, the descent of the spirit into physis is a Gnostic legend that greatly influenced Mani, and it was possibly through the Manichaean influence that it became one of the main ideas of Latin alchemy. The aim of the philosophers was to transform imperfect matter chemically into gold, the panacea or the elixir vitae, but philosophically or mystically into the divine hermaphrodite, the second Adam, the glorified incorruptible body of resurrection, or the lumen luminum, the illumination of the human mind, or sapientia, as I have shown, together with Richard Wilhelm. Chinese alchemy produced the same idea. The goal of the opus magnum is the creation of the diamond body, quote unquote. So here you guys go. I mean, this is just, this is some great stuff here, and there's some real wisdom in these words here. And what I love about Jung is that he's taken this, the angle that he takes this is not this dogmatic angle, and so he's able to take these ideas and put them together without having to have this emotional issue with all of this stuff, which some people will obviously have. So anyways, continuing, we only have a couple more pages left. All these parallels are in an attempt to put my psychological observation into their historical settings. Exactly what I'm saying. Without the historical connections, they would remain suspended in midair, a mere curiosity, although one could find numerous other modern parallels to the dreams described here. For instance, there is the following dream of a young woman. The initial dream was mainly concerned with the memory of an actual experience, a baptizing ceremony in a Protestant sect that took place under the particularly grotesque and even repulsive conditions. The associations were a precipitate of all the dreamer's disappointments with religion. But the dream that came immediately after showed her a picture which she did not understand and could not relate to the previous dream. One could have aided her understanding by the simple device of prefacing her second dream with the words, quote, on the contrary, unquote. This was the dream, okay? Quoting the dream. She was in a planetarium, a very impressive place overhung by the vault of the sky. In the sky, 2 stars were shining, a white one, which was Mercury, but the other star emitted warm red waves of light and was unknown to her. She now saw that the walls underneath the vault were covered with frescoes, but she could recognize only one of them. It was the antique picture of the 3 birds. Oh boy. It was the antique picture of the tree birth of Adonis. And Adonis, you guys, is a Phoenician god who dies and then becomes reborn after 3 days. One in which the women go and they beat their chest and they cry. Just very similarly, how at the death of Jesus there were no apostles, but all the women, the Mary and Mary Magdalene, and the various women were all there, and they, very, very interesting connection. Continuing, quote, the, quote, red waves of light, unquote, she took to be, quote, warm feelings, unquote, i.e., love, and she now thought the star must have been Venus. She had once seen a picture of the tree birth in a museum and had fancied that Adonis, as the dying and resurgent god, must also be a god of rebirth. And he was. And guess when he was rebirthed, guys? In springtime, April. In the first dream, then, there was a violent criticism of church religion, followed by the second dream of the mandala vision of a world clock, which is what a planetarium is in the fullest sense. In the sky, the divine pair stands united, he white, she red, thus reversing the famous alchemical pair where he is red and she is white, whence she was called Bea, Arabic al-Baida, the white one, and he was called Servus Rubeus, the red slave, although as Gabricius, Arabic kibrit sulfur. He is her royal brother. The divine pair makes one think of Guillaume de Digouleville's Christian allegory. The allusion to the tree birth of Adonis corresponds to those dreams of my patient, which had to do with mysterious rites of creation and renewal. So, in principle, these two dreams largely repeat the thought process of my patient, although having nothing in common with the latter except the spiritual malaise of our time. As I have already pointed out, the connection of spontaneous modern symbolism with ancient theories and beliefs is not established by direct or indirect tradition, or even by a secret tradition, or has sometimes been surmised, though there are no tenable proofs of this. The most careful inquiry has never revealed any possibility of my patients being acquainted with the relevant literature or having any information about such ideas, which is such a great point, you guys. You guys should pay attention to that, because it means that it exists in consciousness, in all of our consciousness. You don't have to learn all these things, that they're almost inherently in us. Continuing, it seems that their unconscious worked along the same line of thought which has manifested itself time and time again in the last 2,000 years. Such a continuity can only exist if we assume a certain unconscious condition as inherited a priori factor. By this, I naturally do not mean the inheritance of ideas, which would be difficult if not impossible to prove. I suppose, rather, the inherited quality to be something like the formal possibility of reproducing the same or similar ideas over and over again. I have called this possibility the quote-unquote archetype. Accordingly, the archetype would be a structure, quality, or condition peculiar to a psyche that is somehow connected with the brain. Okay, good. Okay, I'm just making sure. Okay, so we got 2 pages left. In light of these historical parallels, the mandala symbolizes either the divine being hitherto hidden and dormant in the body and now extracted and revivified, or else the vessel or the room in which the transformation of man into divine being takes place. I know such formulations are fatally reminiscent of the wildest metaphysical speculations. I am sorry if it sounds crazy, but this is exactly what the human psyche produces and always has produced. Oh boy, I love that. That's just great. Any psychology which assumes it can do without these facts must exclude them artificially. I would call this a philosophical prejudice and inadmissible from the empirical point of view. I should perhaps emphasize that we do not establish any metaphysical truth with these formulations. It is merely a statement that the psyche functions in such a way, and it is a fact that my patient felt a great deal better after the vision of the mandala. If you understand the problem it solved for him, you can also understand why he had such a feeling of sublime harmony. I would not hesitate for a moment to suppress all speculations about the possible consequences of an experience as abstruse and remote as the mandala, if this were feasible. But for me, unfortunately, this type of experience is neither abstruse nor remote. On the contrary, it is an almost daily occurrence in my profession. I know a fair number of people who have to take their experience seriously if they want to live at all. They can only choose between the devil and the deep blue sea. And that's so true with so many people. The devil is the mandala or something equivalent to it, and the deep blue sea is their neurosis. The well meaning rationalist will point out that I am casting out the devil with Beelzebub and replacing an honest neurosis by the swindling of a religious belief. As to the former charge, I have nothing to say in reply, being no metaphysical expert, but as to the latter one, I beg leave to the point that it is not a question of belief, but experience. I 100% agree with that. Absolutely true. Religious experience is absolute. It cannot be disputed. You can only say that you have never had such an experience. Shit. Sorry, guys. Something just fell off my desk. Let me go back. Religious experience is absolute. You cannot be disputed. You can only say that you have never had such an experience, whereupon your opponent will reply, quote, sorry, I have, unquote. Oh boy. This is a crux between lots of atheists and people who aren't atheists. And there your discussion will come to an end. Exactly. No matter what the world thinks about religious experience, the one who has it possesses a great treasure, a thing that has become for him a source of life, meaning, and beauty, and that has given a new splendor to the world and to mankind. Yes, 100%, guys. He has pistis and peace. Yep. Where is the criterion by which you could say that such a life is not legitimate, that such an experience is not valid, and that such pistis is mere illusion? Is there a matter of fact any better truth about the ultimate things than the one that helps you to live? That is the reason why I take careful account, religio, of the symbols produced by the unconscious. They are the one thing that is capable of convincing the critical mind of modern man, and they are convincing for a very old-fashioned reason. They are overwhelming, which is precisely what the Latin word convincere means. The thing that cures a neurosis must be as convincing as the neurosis, and since the latter is only too real, the helpful experience must be equally real. It must be very real. It must be a very real illusion if you want to put it pessimistically. But what is the difference between a real illusion and a healing religious experience? It is merely a difference of words. You can say, for instance, that life is a disease with a very bad prognosis. It lingers on for years only to end with death, or that normality is a general constitutional defect, or that man is an animal with a fatally overgrown brain. This kind of thinking is the prerogative of habitual grumblers with bad digestions. Oh boy, isn't that the truth? No one can know what the ultimate things are. We must therefore take them as we experience them. 100%. And if such experience helps to make life healthier, more beautiful, and more complete, and more satisfactory to yourself and to those you love, you may safely say, quote, this was the grace of God, unquote. No transcendental truth is thereby demonstrated, and we must confess in all humility that religious experience is extra ecclesiam, subjective, and liable to boundless error. Yet, if the spiritual adventure of our time is the exposure of human consciousness to the undefined and undefinable, there would seem to be good reasons for thinking that even the boundless is pervaded by the psychic laws, which no man invented, but of which he has, quote unquote, gnosis, and the symbolism of Christian dogma. Only heedless fools will wish to destroy this. The lover of the soul, never. Period. And here we have the end of this part. Man, there is so much to say about this book, and I don't know what to tell you, but like a lot of my own experience is reflected in a lot of what Jung talks about, and I really love reading this stuff out because it shows how powerful things can be if people just face life in a way that is constructive rather than building these walls and creating these so-called devils and whatnot. To sort of take away the responsibility of taking control of your own life and finding happiness and contentment and peace in a world that is full of the opposite. So I do appreciate. Honestly, I really very much appreciate all you guys joining me today. I know it was a bit of a long read, but I think that Hopefully, you guys got something out of this kind of stuff. I keep forgetting to put the link to the book in these videos, so I'll try to remember to do that later on today. Otherwise, if you guys enjoyed these readings and the video, please hit the like button, subscribe, share if you think other people would benefit from these kinds of things, because there's just so much great information here. And one of the great things about Carl Jung is that he is somebody who wasn't necessarily a religious type of person, and then eventually, because of his work, let him back into it. And because of that, in his analytical mind and his open mind, I should say, enabled him to be able to pull out some of this great wisdom in a way that a lot of people who aren't necessarily religious in any way could sort of conceptualize, understand, and I think that's important. And then those of the people who are religious will get a better insight into some of their own faiths and their own institutions and the signs and symbols that represent them. So. Thanks again so much for joining me. I love you guys all, and I will be back again tomorrow with a little bit more of this book, the part that will be preceding the quaternity video that I did. But if you guys want to skip over and listen to the quaternity video, feel free to do so. Otherwise, thank you so much. Please hit the like button and subscribe and all that jazz, and I will see you guys on the flip side. Peace.